Debt is a very simple concept. It is a promise. We will borrow money today, we promise to pay it back tomorrow. This promise can be a powerful tool for good. Schools, hospitals, roads. Borrowing can be an engine of progress, helping a nation invest in its future and uplift its people. It allows a government to spend on critical needs now, expecting these investments will generate more wealth later. The bright side of the coin, hope and development. But there is another side, darker and dangerous. What happens when a country cannot keep its promise? A debt crisis unfolds. This is not abstract. It has real, painful consequences for ordinary people. Everything begins to crumble when a government can't pay. A debt trap does not appear overnight. It is often the result of a series of small, poor decisions over time, like a slow leak that eventually floods the entire house. One of the most common causes is simply poor planning. Leaders borrow vast sums with no clear, viable plan. The money might be spent on grand, impressive projects that look good on television. But those projects may not generate real economic returns. Or it might be used to fund short-term populist measures, like subsidies. Subsidies win votes, but they do not build long-term wealth. If borrowed money doesn't boost the economy or create new income streams, the country is left with bigger debt, but no bigger capacity to repay. Another major factor is a large and persistent gap in the national budget. Think of it like a household that consistently spends more than it earns. When a government's spending far exceeds revenue, public services, salaries, projects, and when it collects too little in taxes and from exports, it has to borrow money to cover the difference. Government spending outweighing government income. A small deficit for a short period can be managed, but when the gap remains large year after year, the national debt begins to snowball. The country finds itself borrowing not just for new projects, but simply to pay the interest on its old loans. This is the beginning of a vicious cycle that's very difficult to escape. The terms of the loans themselves can also be a trap. Some lenders are other countries, some are private banks. They may charge very high interest rates. These high rates can make debt grow much faster than the economy. Sometimes loans come with very strict conditions that are hard to meet. A particularly dangerous pitfall is borrowing in a foreign currency, most often the US dollar. Many developing countries do this because lenders prefer it. If the local currency weakens against the dollar, the local amount needed to repay the same dollar loan suddenly shoots up. This currency risk has triggered many debt crises. Finally, we cannot ignore the corrosive effects of corruption. When borrowed funds are stolen by corrupt officials or wasted on poorly managed projects, the public sees no benefit, but the nation is still legally obligated to repay with interest. It is the worst of all worlds. The people bear the burden without enjoying the fruits. On top of this, a country can be pushed over the edge by events beyond its control. Flood, earthquake, war, COVID-19 pandemic. These shocks can decimate main sources of income like tourism and exports, forcing the country to borrow heavily just to survive. The world watches with pity and concern. We'll explain this simply. We'll peel back the jargon to see how a nation falls into a debt trap. Not too long ago, Sri Lanka was often seen as a success story in South Asia. It had a relatively high level of human development, a growing middle class, a booming tourism industry. But underneath this veneer of progress, serious problems were brewing. For years, the country had been borrowing heavily, from China, from Japan, from international bond markets, to fund massive infrastructure projects. Ports were built, airports were built, highways were built, often with loans denominated in foreign currencies. While some projects were needed, many were criticized as economically unviable and saddling the country with enormous debt. The situation took a sharp turn for the worse, with policy missteps and external shocks. In 2019, the government enacted huge tax cuts. Instead, revenue plunged, the budget deficit widened, and borrowing increased. Then came the Easter Sunday bombings in 2019, crippling tourism. Just as it began to recover, COVID-19 shut down international travel. Tourism income vanished almost overnight. At the same time, a ban on chemical fertilizers collapsed agricultural output, forcing the country to import food. In 2022, the consequences unfolded rapidly. Foreign currency reserves dwindled to almost nothing. The country couldn't pay for essential imports, fuel, food. The rupee plummeted, foreign debt costs soared, and hyperinflation followed. People endured long, agonizing queues for basic necessities. There were nationwide power cuts lasting hours each day. Frustration boiled over into massive street protests, and the country's top leadership was ousted. In April 2022, the government declared a sovereign default. The lessons are stark. Heavy borrowing for questionable projects. Risky policies like deep tax cuts, heavy reliance on tourism, can create a perfect storm. Foreign currency debt is a double-edged sword when your currency collapses. Sri Lanka turned to the IMF and partners for a bailout, embarking on painful economic reforms to rebuild what was lost. Zambia, a landlocked country in southern Africa, offers another powerful example of how a nation can fall into a debt trap. For many years, Zambia's economic fate has been tied to the price of a single commodity: copper. Copper is the country's main export and its primary source of foreign currency. When copper prices are high, the Zambian economy does well. When they fall, the economy suffers. Taking advantage of a period of high copper prices and low global interest rates in the early 2010s, Zambia went on a borrowing spree. It borrowed billions of dollars from a wide range of creditors: China private bondholders, multilateral banks. The government used this borrowed money to launch an ambitious infrastructure drive: new roads, bridges, airports, power plants. However, the borrowing was rapid and, critics argue, poorly coordinated. Different government departments were taking on loans without a clear central overview of the country's total debt burden. Many of these loans were in US dollars, exposing Zambia to significant currency risk. The debt level rose at an alarming rate, far outpacing the country's economic growth. The inevitable shock came when the price of copper began to fall on the global market. At the same time, economic growth slowed, and the Zambian kwacha, the local currency, began to weaken against the US dollar. Suddenly, the cost of servicing its massive foreign debt became overwhelming. The government was spending a huge portion of its revenue just on interest payments, leaving little money for healthcare, education, and other essential public services. The situation was made even worse by the economic disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which further squeezed government finances and the global economy. In late 2020, Zambia reached a breaking point. The government announced that it could no longer make payments on some of its foreign loans, making it the first African nation to default on its sovereign debt in the pandemic era. This default severely damaged Zambia's reputation with international investors, making it much harder and more expensive to borrow in the future. The country has since been locked in complex and protracted negotiations with its diverse group of creditors, including China Western bondholders, as well as the IMF, to restructure its debt. Zambia's story is a classic tale of a commodity-dependent nation that borrowed heavily during the good times. Argentina's relationship with debt is not a single crisis, but a long, painful history of recurring nightmares. The country seems trapped in a tragic cycle: borrowing, boom, bust, default. That cycle has repeated for decades. A nation blessed with rich natural resources and a skilled population, yet struggling for lasting economic stability. One prominent example: the crisis that culminated in 2001. Argentina defaulted on nearly $100 billion, the largest sovereign default at the time. The event plunged the country into a deep economic depression. Unemployment soared, millions fell into poverty. Root causes are complex. Governments often spent far more than they collected in taxes, creating chronic fiscal deficits financed by printing money and borrowing. Money printing fueled rampant inflation, eroding the value of the peso. People lost faith in the peso, rushed to convert savings into US dollars. That created constant dollar demand and downward pressure on the peso. Two names almost always come up: the IMF and the World Bank. These are powerful international financial institutions, but they have very different roles. It is important to understand what each one does. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, acts like a financial firefighter for the global economy. Its main purpose is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system. It helps countries that are facing a short-term crisis, particularly a balance of payments problem. This happens when a country cannot get enough foreign currency, like US dollars, to pay for its essential imports and its foreign debt payments. When a country is on the brink of default and its currency is collapsing, it can turn to the IMF for a loan. The IMF provides this emergency financing to help the country stabilize its economy, rebuild its foreign reserves, and restore confidence. However, this help comes with strings attached. The IMF usually requires the borrowing country to implement a set of policy reforms, known as conditionalities, cutting government spending, raising taxes, increasing interest rates to fight inflation, making the economy more open to trade and investment. The goal is to fix the underlying problems that caused the crisis in the first place. The World Bank, on the other hand, has a different mission. It is not a firefighter, but more of a long-term builder. Its primary goal is to reduce poverty and support long-term economic development. Long-term loans grants technical assistance. These projects are designed to improve people's lives and build the foundations of a healthy economy. Building new schools, improving sanitation and water supply systems, constructing roads to connect rural areas, investing in renewable energy sources. The focus is on long-term growth and poverty alleviation, not on short-term crisis management. While both institutions lend money to countries, their approaches and goals are distinct. The IMF focuses on macroeconomic stability and short-term financial crises. Its loans are meant to be repaid over a relatively short period, typically 3 to 5 years. The World Bank focuses on long-term development projects and poverty reduction, with its loans often having repayment periods of 20 years or more. However, they do face criticisms. The IMF's conditions are often accused of being too harsh, forcing painful austerity measures that hurt the poorest citizens. The World Bank has been criticized for funding large projects that sometimes had negative social or environmental impacts. Despite this, they remain central players in the global financial architecture. We'll point out warning signs, red flags, and practical fixes that can help avoid this fate. This matters to everyone. So, who is next? Predicting the exact time and place of the next debt crisis is impossible, but we can identify the warning signs and the countries that are showing them. These red flags are the indicators that tell us a country's financial health is deteriorating. One of the most obvious signals is a rapid and sustained increase in public debt, especially when measured as a percentage of the country's gross domestic product. When debt is growing much faster than the economy, it is a clear sign of trouble. Another critical warning is a growing share of that debt being held in foreign currency, which, as we have seen, is a major vulnerability. We can also look at a country's foreign currency reserves. These reserves are a nation's safety cushion, used to pay for imports and service foreign debt during tough times. When these reserves start to fall rapidly, it is like watching the water level drop before a tsunami. It indicates the country is losing its ability to meet its international obligations. A persistently large fiscal deficit, the gap between government spending and income, is another major red flag. It shows that the government is living beyond its means and relying on unsustainable levels of borrowing. Finally, when investors start getting nervous and demand very high interest rates to lend to a country, or refuse to lend at all, it is a sign that the crisis is no longer looming but may have already arrived. Based on these warning signs, experts and international institutions like the IMF and World Bank are currently watching a number of countries with concern. Many low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are under severe debt distress. They have been hit by a combination of the pandemic, rising food and energy prices, and higher global interest rates. Countries like Pakistan are facing significant balance of payments stress, with low foreign reserves and a large debt burden. In the Middle East, Lebanon has already experienced a complete economic and currency collapse, and its path to recovery is unclear. Other vulnerable nations include those that are heavily dependent on a single export commodity, as they are at the mercy of volatile global prices. And we cannot forget the small island developing states, which face a unique and existential threat. They are often burdened with high debt due to their small economies and high import costs, and they are also on the front lines of climate change. A single hurricane or a rise in sea levels can wipe out a significant portion of their economy, forcing them to borrow even more just to rebuild. While the list of countries changes, the underlying vulnerabilities, high foreign debt, low reserves, large deficits, and economic fragility remain the constant precursors to a crisis. To understand how this works in practice, let us take a simple, hypothetical example. Imagine a small nation, let's call it Inara, that depends heavily on coffee exports for its income. The government of Inara decides to borrow $2 billion in US dollars to build a state-of-the-art international airport. The idea is to boost tourism and trade. The loan has a moderately high interest rate. The leaders announce the project with great fanfare, promising a new era of prosperity for everyone. The plan seems plausible on the surface. A new airport should, in theory, attract more visitors and business, which would then generate more revenue for the country. However, things start to go wrong. The construction of the airport is plagued by delays and cost overruns, partly due to mismanagement and corruption. The final cost balloons to nearly $3 billion, forcing Inara to take on additional loans. When the airport finally opens, the expected flood of tourists does not materialize. The global economic climate is weak, and competing destinations offer better value. The airport operates at only a fraction of its capacity. It is a beautiful, modern facility, but it is not generating the income needed to start paying back that massive $2 billion loan, let alone the extra billion that was borrowed to finish it. Now the interest payments on the loans are due. Since the airport is not making money, the government of Inara has to find the funds from its existing budget. This means less money is available for schools, hospitals, and maintaining roads. At the same time, the price of coffee on the world market suddenly drops due to a bumper crop in other, larger producing countries. Inara's main source of foreign currency income is slashed. To make matters even worse, Inara's local currency begins to weaken against the US dollar. The $2 billion debt, which was already a burden, now becomes an even heavier one in local currency terms. The government is now in a desperate situation. It cannot pay the interest on its existing debt from its own revenues. So, it is forced to do something very dangerous. It borrows more money just to pay the interest on its old loans. This is the classic debt trap. The country is now on a treadmill, running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Lenders start to get nervous. They begin demanding even higher interest rates for any new loans, seeing Inara as a risky borrower. This is the downward spiral. A single, poorly planned project, combined with some bad luck, has pushed an entire nation to the brink of economic collapse. A debt crisis is not an inescapable fate. It is the outcome of choices, and therefore, better choices can lead to a better outcome. The path away from the debt trap begins with better, more transparent planning. Governments must borrow with a clear purpose, investing in projects that will genuinely boost economic growth, create jobs, generate the revenue needed for repayment. Every major loan should be subject to public scrutiny. Put loan terms and spending plans out in the open. That transparency makes corruption much harder to take root. It also prevents leaders from signing bad deals for short-term gain. Building resilience is absolutely critical. Countries shouldn't live hand to mouth. Build foreign currency reserves during the good times, a buffer for storms. Diversify the economy. Relying on one or two exports is risky. Oil, copper, tourism. Encourage new industries. Expand trade partnerships. Prioritize borrowing in local currency where possible. That removes big exchange rate risk. Strengthen domestic institutions. Build a fair, efficient tax system. Give governments reliable domestic revenue so they don't overborrow. Protect social spending. A government's first duty is its people. Cuts to healthcare. Cuts to education might seem like an easy way to save money in the short term, but they cripple the country's long-term potential. If a country gets into trouble, act decisively. Negotiate fairer terms with lenders. Ask for debt relief before it gets unmanageable. Debt is a tool. A hammer can build a house. A hammer can tear it down. The difference is the wisdom and skill of the wielder. Nations must learn to use debt wisely. Lenders must offer fair, sustainable terms. Reckless lending helps no one. Citizens must watch the red flags. Hold leaders accountable. Make smart choices. Make transparent choices. Make people-centric choices. Use debt to build a stronger, more prosperous future. A debt crisis can send shockwaves that affect trade, investment, global stability. In an interconnected world, your neighbor's financial health is your own. We'll explore causes, case studies, key players, potential solutions. Who's most vulnerable today? What can be done to steer them towards stability and growth?